The journey to become a recognized writer and to make a living by writing has been long and hard, full of uncertainty and exhausting. We pay tribute to Savidya by recognizing the fact that he is Trinidad and Tobago's most significant contribution to world literature and to writing. We come together on this St. Augustine campus to acknowledge the formidable body of work produced by this creative genius and to underscore the value of his work as a significant contribution to letters. We appreciate this work as a bridge to our deeper understanding of our human condition and as a magnificent endowment to Caribbean and world civilization. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a resounding round of applause for a living testimony of great writing, our very own V.S. Naipaul, the man who took a simple St. James Street into the imagination of readers all over the world.
The first piece is from a book called Half a Life, and it deals in irony. Its tone is ironical. So you'll have to listen carefully to see whether the words mean what you think they mean. They might mean something different. My decision was simple. It was to turn my back on our ancestry, the foolish, foreign-ruled, starveling priests my grandfather had told me about. To turn my back on all my father's foolish hopes for me as someone high in the Maharaja's service, all the foolish hopes of the college principal to have me marry his daughter. My decision was to turn my back on all those ways of death, to trample on them, and to do the only noble thing that lay in my power, which was to marry the lowest person I could find. I actually had someone in mind. There was a girl at the university. I didn't know her. I hadn't spoken to her. I had merely noticed her. She was small and coarse-featured, almost tribal in appearance, noticeably black, with two big top teeth that showed very white. She wore colors that were sometimes very bright and sometimes very muddy, seeming to run into the blackness of her skin.
The late and famous Sir Leonard Courtney Hannes, while a young student at the college, was accosted by his master, Mr. Hancock. Mr. Hancock pointed his cane at him and said, "Hannes, there is a fool at the end of my cane." Sir Courtney replied, "At which end, sir?" to the great amusement of his fellow students and embarrassment of Mr. Hancock.
All of this is so reassuring to me that in spite of what might be said, there are still standards, and there are people who are honoring standards. I'm immensely delighted, and by this occasion and by all that it symbolizes for me and for you, thank you very much. Now we'll go back to the very beginning of things, to our own Miguel Street. The idea for this book came to me quite miraculously in the middle of 1955. That's a long time ago. That's 50-something years. In the beginning, I used to write a story a day. It came so readily. Later, as the stories became more complicated, I took more time. But at the end of this book, I had become a writer in my own eyes.
I would do a book, or try to do a book, about a man who, at the end, considers the things around him, which he has acquired, and reflects on the stories, or the narrative that they imply. And that was how that book began. For some reason, I think probably because I had no great faith in attempting this kind of narrative, something so big, I began writing it in pencil on unlined paper. Very painful for me, very painful. And I did this for about 6 months. I'm not sure about the length of time. It used to be on the manuscript, which has now been destroyed. So I can't give you the exact time. And then it began to catch fire. Then I began to type. Now, I used to read my work as it progressed to my wife. She was a very, very good listener, very good critic. And it was her admiration and her encouragement which made me feel that this was a very great book. And that continued until the book was finished. I had no doubt about it, because after this encouragement, and I began to feel it myself, it wasn't there at the beginning, you understand. The whole thing grew. I haven't really read the book again. Without that book, I wouldn't have that sense of myself. And what is interesting about that book, contrary to what people might feel, is that much of it exists only in the imagination, because life is seldom so neat. The writer has to make up incidents, make up, not settings, the setting was given me. But it exercised that bit of my creative faculty, the imagination. So that could set me free. And the difficulty of that then was to go on. How do you go on? Because I was so exhausted by the book. I'm feeling the fingers now, because in those days we had typewriters, and I had to type out a fair copy, and my fingers hurt. I tried to tape them, they still hurt. Then I had to get someone to help me type it out, which I didn't like, because I like to exercise the final control over what I'm writing.
I know the man who likes to sit on this porch, and he likes to look at the color blue, and he finds that the blue in Trinidad, in the sky, is different from any blue that he sees elsewhere in the world. The man who also enjoys watching the birds feeding and gets a lot of enjoyment out of that and a cool breeze. The man who enjoys eating pemi, because he enjoys pemi very much, and curried shrimps. And that's what he loves about Trinidad and the people. One of the things he does when he came last year for 2 weeks was he went to visit people that he knew from way back when. And one was a woodworker, another man was a roti maker. But these are people that he liked and he had formed attachments to. And every time he comes, he makes an effort, even though he's very aged, to go out and actually see these people and meet them and say hello. Uncle Vito could sit for hours and not say anything. And it's because he's thinking, formulating, and his writing. And we know as children never to have not to disturb him when he is like that. And I remember when he was writing, he would just go and he would start writing. But he was also very regimented as a writer as well. He would get up, he would have his breakfast, then he would start writing until lunch, and then lunchtime, and then he would have a rest, practice some yoga, and then in the evening he would start writing again, and then in the just before dinner, just review his writing by reading it out to us as well. This is when we were I was in England staying with them, and remarking on that. That was the only work that he remarked on, and he would, sometimes my Auntie Pat, he would sound off on sentences and paragraphs with her, and they would discuss what he had just written.
Because my father had to look after his family and didn't have the time to give towards writing, he must have felt that if he had stayed in Trinidad, he would be swallowed up and condemned to a non-life. And I think this was perhaps the reason, understanding our financial position, that he decided very early on to work for the scholarship. He felt that the scholarship was his ticket towards going away. And I think when the results of the scholarship came out, and he was not awarded the scholarship, he was very upset when a rumor suggested that he had in fact won the scholarship, but it was not given to him. And my father decided to pursue the rumor, because the rumor had pretty good sources, in that one of the former teachers of QRC was working in the Ministry of Education at the time. And so my father and my uncle, they must have been getting on pretty well at that time, went to various members of the Board of Education to pursue this rumor to see if there was any truth in it. And then he discovered, in fact, there was a great deal of truth in it, that he should have been awarded the scholarship, but it was claimed that QRC had entered him for the wrong groups for the scholarship exam. Now, you've got to understand what Queen's Royal College was at that stage. And it was an institution where people regarded going to Queen's Royal College was like going to a university. So that they should have made such an error seemed so unlikely and so unreal. When he was awarded the scholarship, I think people really were quite stunned, and I think very, very few people know the truth of that situation. He was entered for 2 groups and 2 subsidiary subjects, and a young man by the name of Albert Mark, who I'm sure has done very well, gone on from St. Mary's College, was awarded that scholarship. And I think when he discovered the marks later on, when he worked as a secretary for a short while in QRC, I think he was absolutely stunned to think that he was not awarded the scholarship. There was a great difference in the marks that in his favor, yes. His lowest mark was 73% in that exam, and I think his highest mark was 96 or 97. And there was no comparison, and he actually wrote it down in a book, a prize that QRC had given him. He wrote it on the cover of it while he was at QRC, and I think that must have jolted him. He wrote the marks down, a table of the marks, and he wrote the marks of 48, the marks of 49, and the marks of like 2 other students who had done the exams there. So it's a table of comparison of the marks there. So you see his Spanish marks, his French marks, his Roman history marks, his GP marks, and I think averages. The numbers come out with him distinctly as number 1. I would imagine at 16 you will be horrified with that. I think that you would feel, my God, you know, this is so grossly unfair. I think it would have affected him.
I think it was deserved a long time ago, and I'm very glad that it was done. Not only am I glad about it, he's accepting it so very well.
It's just this wonderful passage in The Enigma of Arrival, where you say the West Indies had given you the world as a writer, in that it had that historical context in which you were born and had to grow out of, shaped a kind of worldview that had made you metropolitan. Could you elaborate on how you understand the relationship between West Indian and that new understanding of metropolitan you offer us in Enigma of Arrival?
If you were born here, you were surrounded by many different kinds of people. And if you're a writer, you take an interest in them. And you know that the world is incomplete unless you've explored them all, unless you've explored the various cultures that you've been in contact with since your early childhood. And this makes you quite different from people who come from a complete culture, who have possessed that culture from the start, who see it every day on the television and in the newspapers. They see an idea of themselves thrown back at themselves. But for someone like me, it wasn't like that. I just wished to explore what I saw, and I really, because I couldn't keep on doing fiction, because the material was limited. The island material is very limited. You do so many books and then there's nothing more to do. But you're a writer, you have to keep on looking at the world. And the world has been given you by your childhood. That's what I meant. I meant this kind of cosmopolitan background. It does matter, it does mean something. And it has made me as a writer and explains the various ways I've gone about doing my work.
I've written about it quite often, about how important it was to get started, because at the beginning, you don't know who you are. You don't know whether you're a funny person, a serious person, a tragic person. You don't know, you have to find out. And I had written 2 books in the 5 years I'd been in England, from 50 to 54, shall we say. One was a farce, and the other was a rather pointless, heavy exercise, which fortunately I had to drop. And then I came across this this material, in my memory, of course, and got started. And it happened very fast. And I never looked back. There were long periods of waiting for new material. But that was the beginning. And so those early books are very important. But I've just written about them in a preface to the book that's coming out in a few months. I said that I recall the street and I wrote about them, wrote about the people in the street, and it probably was a flat view. And I said I meant by that I was writing about them the way the child had seen them, very flat. And I went on to say that I also knew when I was writing that if I could take a step or two or three back from the material, I would have to write in another way. And if I were to worry about people's various identities and ethnic identities and cultural identities, I'd have to write another book altogether. And I said then that all my life, and I meant my writing life, I've been aware of ways of looking and how every way alters the configuration of the world. So it might seem to people that, I mean, very foolish people have said they're sorry what happened afterwards, that I should have stayed with that way of writing. But I couldn't do that because I'd exhausted a vein. And I had to do the other side, or many sides, of my nature and learning. And I had to write in different ways. So it would seem it's the same material but being looked at in a different way. You write a book like that, like Miguel Street, and then just 10 years later, you're attempting a very difficult book like The Mimic Men, not knowing quite what you're writing about, just expressing a need to write this material. And they're part of the same thing.
Who really is V.S. Naipaul beyond the Nobel Prize, the awards, the accolades, the criticism? Is he a man who regrets coming into a world where there are no good men and lots of uneducated drumbeaters celebrating a son of the soil? Or is he a brilliant mind, light years ahead of others, who recognizes human frailty and makes millions writing about it?
You see, the trouble about your questions, they contain their own answers, you know? So that's all right, that's all right, that's all right, that's all right. The writer doesn't know who he is. That is for the critic. The critic reads a book, and if he's a good critic, he sees things in it that the writer might not himself have noticed. The writer will notice it years later. Oh goodness, I was doing that then. But at the time he was doing something else. So the questions you asked are for the outsider to pronounce on.
It is a rare gift when a society as small as Trinidad and Tobago can lay claim to an artist who has attained the international standard of excellence as V.S. Naipaul has. He's among one of our most accomplished achievers, and for over 50 years, with seemingly inexhaustible creative versatility and will, Naipaul has emerged as one of the planet's most outstanding literary voices. His admirably large and exquisitely crafted literary output has engaged societies, histories, traditions, and landscapes that include those of his Caribbean homeland, Latin America, North America, England, Africa, and India, all of which he claims are his, the legacy of his Trinidadian origins, that small island in the mouth of the great Orinoco River of Venezuela that has given him the world. Love him or leave him, Naipaul's voice is irresistible, even as it can disturb and exasperate, illuminate, and vex us. He is one of the most insightful readers of the human condition, a penetrative analyst of modern social systems, gifted with the ability to stir deep passions by his at times brutal perception that is unrelenting in unmasking our most guarded illusions and vulnerabilities, and in bringing into question some of our most ardent beliefs and stubborn prejudices.
He was, as I say, difficult, moody for such an intellectual man. Moody means that he would have his days when, I guess, depending on how his writing was going, he would be in a bad mood. And he would not be very communicative. Or he would growl at us and stuff like that, you know, because he was grumpy that day. So that would put a little fright in us, you know.
One travels and one looks without prejudice. By that I mean, one never injects one's hopes into any situation. One never injects a political point of view or political dogma into any situation. One just sees what is. And the reason why it's important to do this, looking and seeing how things are, is that the future is always contained in the present. The future is not a great surprise. If we examine everything now, we will know what this place will be in 20 or 30 years. And Europe and Africa, we will know that. It's important just to look. These islands have a different history from across the water. And we should not look for props from other regions to make us understand where we are. We have to look at what we have. I have not written any book which would give any clues to the nature of my life. I've used my life, aspects of it, to explore the world in which I find myself. I have not been presenting myself as a subject fit for dissection.
He haunts himself in his characters, even when he seems to distance them so markedly from himself. These factors combine to produce the particular set of nerves that constitute the writer V.S. Naipaul. I use set in two senses, as group or collection, and also as disposition, as in mindset or set of face.
Naipaul makes the point that in terms of what at that moment it was possible to imagine oneself as a colonial striving to attain through language, Lebrun had achieved it all. Naipaul's representation of this relationship allows him to foreground a number of similarities between himself and a historical figure that many consider his nemesis. For contemporary Caribbean critics, James epitomizes a tradition of committed black intellectual thought associated with such figures as George Padmore, Frantz Fanon, and Eric Williams, to name a few. It is a tradition from which Naipaul often has been accused of distancing himself. That perspective on the opposition between Naipaul and James sits well on both sides of the literary and ideological divide, where Naipaul is ostracized on the one hand as a betrayer of the third world, or is lionized on the other as a consummate aesthete and man of conscience. For both kinds of readers, the essential Naipaul is a man divorced from his Caribbean roots.
So he is suffering multiple displacements, and this is a letter that Naipaul writes when he's very young. He says, this is in 1954, he's a student at Oxford University. He says the future is as blank as ever. Nobody loves me. Nobody wants me. In England, I'm not English. In India, I'm not Indian. I'm chained to the 1,000 square miles that is Trinidad, but I will evade that fate yet.
What is Naipaul at this time after that? He remains unrepentant. He still sees the Caribbean as a small society. He feels that justice was not done in 1962, and he at least in the 1990s, he wanted to do more justice. He insists that he has not changed in his outlook, his attitudes, or in his writing. He still feels that the writer must undermine the society, and he said so last night, in the presentation last night, that the writer must undermine the society if he is to be useful to it. And he felt that if he was more critical and more undermining in his earlier writings, he would have exposed a few more things which might just have changed the societies.
It is almost beyond belief that this man of the century, who began his career in 1957 with the Mystic Messiah, should have, in the span of 43 years, consistently produced the best works in West Indian writing, touching on history, philosophy, politics, and religion. Apart from the books which came from the mainstream of his rich, creative powers. From a literary point of view, no tribute to Vidya Naipaul can border on the excessive, for he has enriched the literary world, thus giving us a permanent place in the sun.
This is the dilemma. Staying home and usually achieving nothing, little acclaim, or going abroad in order to get published, reach an audience, and then be judged successful at home. And why this going abroad? Why this need to leave? Because for Roach, for Naipaul, and many other early West Indian writers, they felt they lacked local models and authorial traditions. Yet out of this void, and out of the anguish and the vain mimicry which constituted colonial education, out of a society that mocked the profession of writer, Naipaul's father, C. Prasad, did produce stories, did become a writer. And of course, the story of how he became a writer is now a classic of West Indian literature, A House for Mr. Biswas.
A writer must be supported by the knowledge that he comes from a society with which he is in dialogue. Naipaul also believed that a writer like himself had no society. He described in 1971 the dual alienation he felt growing up in Trinidad. The Trinidad I came from was colonial and was originally a slave society to which later people like myself from Asia went. There was a double inferiority about it. The slave society which created nothing, which depended for everything on the master society, and the Asiatic living in this closed society of myth. Clearly, no visit back home like the one envisaged by James could heal this cancer of a double inferiority which Naipaul must have carried throughout the QRC years.
Small society with no history, very small educated element. I don't see how it can move in the world. Societies need talent to progress, to move ahead, and I think that in these small societies, the talent inevitably runs away, goes to other countries, goes to the bigger countries that offer more opportunities. And I think this will be a great problem for a long time to come.
Elias said to him, I changed my mind. I think I want to be a sanitary inspector. I really like the work. For 3 years, Elias sat the sanitary inspector's examination, and he failed every time. Elias began saying, what the hell do you expect in Trinidad? You've got to bribe anybody if you want to get your toenail cut. Had said, I meet a man from a boat the other day, and he told me that the sanitary inspector exams in British Guyana are much easier. You could go to BG and take the exams there and come back and work here. Elias flew to BG, wrote the exam, failed it, and flew back. Had said, I met a man from Barbados. He told me that the exam's easier in Barbados. Easy, easy, he said. Elias flew to Barbados, wrote the exam, failed it, and flew back. Had said, I met a man from Grenada the other day. Elias said, shut your mouth up before it has trouble between we and the street. A few years later, I sat the Cambridge Senior Certificate exam myself, and Mr. Cambridge gave me a second grade. I applied for a job in the customs, and I got it. I got a khaki uniform with brass buttons and a cap, very much like the sanitary inspector's uniform. Elias wanted to beat me up the first day I wore the uniform. What'd your mother do to get you that, he shouted. And I was going to go for him when Eddowes put a stop to it. Stopped it. Eddowes said he's just sad and jealous. He don't mean anything. For Elias had become one of our street aristocrats. He was driving the scavenging carts. No theory here, Elias used to say. This is the practical. I really like the work. That's where it ends.